I don't know why I rented that cabin. Looking back, it was a stupid decision, but at the time, it made sense. I needed a break. London was suffocating. The endless noise, the rush, the constant feeling that I was falling behind. My job wasn't even that bad, but it drained me in ways I couldn't explain. So when I found a cheap, remote cabin for rent in Northumberland, it felt like a sign. The listing described it as a secluded retreat in the woods, perfect for unwinding. No Wi-Fi, limited cell service. That was fine. I wanted to unplug, to sit in silence, to let my thoughts settle. The pictures showed a modest wooden cabin with a stone fireplace, a single bedroom, and a small deck overlooking the trees. It looked cozy, peaceful. I booked it for a week. The drive there was long. I left London in the early morning, stopping only for petrol and coffee. As I got further north, the roads narrowed, twisting through forests and empty fields. I didn't see many other cars. The sky was gray, and rain drizzled in slow, steady waves. Typical English weather. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting behind thick clouds. The place looked exactly like the pictures, maybe a bit older, a bit more worn. The wooden walls were dark with age, and the windows were small, tucked beneath the sloping roof. The forest surrounded it on all sides, thick and quiet. No other houses, no signs of life. Inside, the air smelled like damp wood and old stone. The furniture was simple, a small sofa, a wooden table, a few chairs. The fireplace was stocked with logs. The kitchen was basic but functional, the bedroom small but clean. It was enough. The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent my time reading, walking in the woods, and cooking simple meals. At night, I sat by the fire with a book, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. The isolation felt good, cleansing. Then, on the third night, I saw him. It was late. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and I was getting ready for bed. As I passed by the window, something caught my eye. A shape, a shadow in the trees. I froze. It was a man. He stood just beyond the tree line, half hidden by the darkness. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching. A cold wave of fear crept through me. I tried to make sense of it. A hiker? A hunter? Someone lost? But why would he be standing there, still as stone, at this hour? I turned off the lights, hoping it would make it harder for him to see inside. My heart was hammering. I watched for a while, barely breathing. He didn't move. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and forced myself to go to bed. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. I kept picturing him out there, standing in the dark, waiting. When I woke up, the first thing I did was check outside. He was gone. Relief flooded through me. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just some random guy passing through. Maybe I'd imagined it. I shook off the fear and went about my day. I forced myself to enjoy the quiet, to push the thought of that man out of my mind. But the feeling lingered, a tight knot in my stomach. That night, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I kept the curtains drawn. I didn't want to see anything outside, but it didn't matter. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a jolt. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it. Soft, slow footsteps outside. I held my breath, my heart pounding. The footsteps circled the cabin, crunching over the gravel path. Slow, deliberate. I stayed completely still. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe, but I knew that wasn't true. I started carrying a knife from the kitchen, keeping it next to me at all times. I moved a chair against the front door at night, as if that would make a difference. By the 5th day, I was barely holding it together. The silence of the woods, once peaceful, now felt suffocating. Every creak, every rustle of leaves sent my nerves into overdrive. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't paranoid. There was someone out there, and he wasn't leaving. It rained that night, hard. The kind of rain that pounds against the roof, drowns out every other sound. I thought maybe, just maybe, it would keep him away. I was wrong. Sometime past midnight, I heard it. The sound of the front door handle turning. Slow. Testing. I bolted upright in bed, every muscle in my body tense. The door was locked. The chair was still in place. Then, a tap on the window. Not a knock. A single, deliberate tap. I didn't move.
Top.
Again slow. Calculated. I gripped the knife so hard my knuckles ached. My breathing was shallow, my body frozen. Then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my ears straining for any sound. The rain hammered against the cabin, masking everything else. I didn't sleep. I didn't close my eyes once. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about my booking. I didn't care about the refund. I threw everything into my car and drove, heart pounding, eyes darting to the trees. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I saw him, standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until I reached the nearest town, until I was surrounded by people, by noise, by life. I never went back. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted. But I know one thing. He was waiting for something, and I'm glad I didn't stay long enough to find out what. I retired early. It wasn't by choice, it was more the force of things than anything. After 25 years with the force, you either go out on your own terms or the job wears you out. I wasn't gonna let it wear me out. Too many colleagues I had seen go the other route. The stress, the hours, the constant danger, it changed them. I didn't want to end up like that. So, I bought a little cabin up north, somewhere in the dense woods of the Adirondacks. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a place to clear my mind and finally enjoy some peace after the chaos of the city. The property was cheap, tucked away in a part of the forest most people didn't bother with. And that was exactly what I wanted: solitude. I didn't want neighbors. I didn't want people to bother me. I wanted to hear nothing but the wind through the trees and the crunch of leaves underfoot. The cabin itself was a small, simple structure, a one-room shack with a loft above for sleeping. There was a stone fireplace, a wood stove for heat, and a small kitchen with an old-fashioned gas stove. It didn't have electricity, just a couple of oil lamps for light at night. It was the perfect place to disappear. I wasn't entirely isolated, of course. There was a small town about an hour's drive away, but I wasn't there to make friends. I wasn't there to mingle. I was there to be alone with my thoughts. The only real connection I had to the outside world was the radio, which only worked if the weather was good. That was fine by me. I didn't care much for the news or the noise of the world. My first month there went by without incident. I spent most of my time fixing up the cabin, chopping wood, and going on long walks through the forest. The air was fresh, and the quiet was deafening in the best possible way. But then, one evening, as I was sitting by the fire, I noticed something strange. It was just after dark, around 9 p.m. The fire had burned down to embers, and I had just made myself a cup of coffee when I heard it. A faint rustling noise coming from the woods outside. It wasn't the sound of an animal, though. It was too deliberate, too human. I stood up, careful not to make a sound, and walked over to the window. The moon was full, casting a pale light across the forest. I didn't see anything at first, but I could feel that something was off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was that old cop instinct. Something wasn't right, and I knew it. I grabbed my flashlight from the table and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it didn't reveal anything unusual. No signs of movement, no animal tracks. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sound came again, closer this time. I whipped the light around, but all I saw was trees. Tall, thick pines that stretched up into the night sky. But there was something in the way the trees shifted, like they were hiding something. A figure, maybe two figures. I knew better than to go rushing out there. I'd spent enough years on the force to know that when you feel something's off, you don't just run headlong into danger. You wait, you observe, and that's exactly what I did. For the next few hours, I kept an eye on the woods from the safety of the cabin. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I finally forced myself to sleep, though it wasn't easy. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder than usual. Every gust of wind felt like it was pushing against the walls. The next morning, I checked around the perimeter of the cabin. No signs of forced entry, no tracks in the snow. Everything seemed normal, but there was still that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, like something was off. A week passed, and I started to convince myself that maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the isolation had finally gotten to me. But then it happened again. I was inside, chopping wood for the stove when I heard the rustling sound once more, this time closer, right outside the cabin. I froze, the axe in my hand, and listened. The sound was unmistakable now, footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate. I slowly set the axe down and crept to the window. Through the glass, I saw a shadow moving just beyond the tree line. I couldn't make out details, but I could see the shape of someone, tall, thin, and moving like they knew I was watching. I grabbed my rifle, the one I kept for protection. I wasn't worried about bears or wolves, but a person? That was something else entirely. I waited in silence for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. Whoever it was didn't come closer, and I didn't hear any more footsteps. After a while, I began to doubt myself. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe the wind was playing tricks. Couldn't be sure, but I wasn't taking any chances. I decided to head into town for a few days to clear my head, just to make sure I wasn't losing it. I locked up the cabin and drove down the winding road that led to the town. It felt good to be away from the woods for a bit, to be around other people. The radio played softly in the background, and I tried to focus on the normal world outside my cabin. But even then, I couldn't shake the unease. Something wasn't right. I wasn't sure what, but I knew I needed to figure it out. The next few days passed without incident, but my mind kept returning to the cabin, to the woods. And then, on the fourth day, I received a call. It was the sheriff. He asked if I had been back at the cabin yet. I told him no, that I was still in town. He sounded serious. There's been a break-in. Someone's been snooping around your place. My stomach dropped. I asked if they had caught the person, but he said no. Whoever it was had left without a trace. The sheriff wanted to know if I had seen anyone strange recently, but I didn't have much to tell him. Just the odd rustling in the woods. I hung up the phone, my heart racing. I knew I had to go back. The feeling of being watched was back in full force. I drove straight to the cabin, adrenaline pumping through me. When I got there, the place was eerily quiet. There were no signs of forced entry, but I noticed the door was slightly ajar. Someone had been inside. I stepped cautiously over the threshold, my eyes scanning every corner of the cabin. Everything looked undisturbed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, waiting for me to return. That night, I locked every door and window, checked the perimeter again, and sat in the dark, waiting. Hours passed, and just when I was starting to let my guard down, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just outside. I wasn't going to let whatever it was catch me off guard. This time, I was ready. I grabbed my rifle and slowly moved to the window. The moonlight illuminated the forest, and there, Just beyond the trees, I saw him, a man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, his face obscured by the shadows. But it was clear he was watching me. I knew he had to be the one who had been lurking around the cabin. I didn't hesitate. I opened the door and stepped outside, the rifle aimed at the figure. I wasn't going to let him get away again, but just as I was about to confront him, he turned and disappeared into the woods, vanishing into the night. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but he didn't come back. The woods were silent again, and the feeling of being watched finally faded. The next day, I went into town and spoke to the sheriff. He said he'd send someone to investigate, but I knew it was only a matter of time before I saw that man again. The sheriff's deputy did come out and search the area, but they found nothing. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. As far as they were concerned, it was just another one of those things that couldn't be explained. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen. I decided to stay a few more weeks, determined to not let fear drive me away from the place I had worked so hard to make my home. There were moments when the fear crept back, but I would stand my ground. The man never returned, and over time, the unease faded. The forest returned to its peaceful silence, and life slowly returned to normal. I don't know what he was after or why he was watching me, but I do know one thing. The woods can be a quiet place, but they are never truly silent. There's always something out there, something watching, waiting. But in the end, I was the one who stayed. I was the one who didn't let the fear take me. The man never came back, and I could finally breathe easy again. The woods were mine again, and this time I was ready. I never really thought much about the cabin when my friend first invited me up to his family's place for the weekend. The promise of peace, some time away from work, and the chance to let my dog, Max, stretch his legs in the wide open seemed like the perfect escape. The woods had always seemed like a quiet, safe place to me. There was something reassuring about the stillness of the trees, the steady hum of nature that always felt so far removed from the city. Max, a shepherd mix, had been with me for 5 years. He was always by my side, loyal and protective. We were close, the kind of bond that only grows with time and experience. He'd been through my roughest moments, and I had been there for him when he was just a pup, scared of his own shadow. We drove up to the cabin early that Friday afternoon. It wasn't the kind of cabin you'd find on Pinterest. No modern amenities or large windows to let in the sunlight. It was old, worn, and looked like it had been standing for decades, if not longer. The roof had patches, and the wood was grayed by the elements. My friend, Adam, assured me it was perfectly safe and that it was the perfect place to relax. As we arrived, I could already tell that the cabin sat on the edge of something vast. The woods stretched out in all directions, a dark, thick tangle of trees that seemed to close in around us. There was something unsettling about it, a presence I couldn't quite put my finger on. I unloaded the car while Adam wandered around, checking on things, making sure everything was in order. Max immediately started sniffing around, his tail wagging with excitement, oblivious to whatever unease was creeping into the pit of my stomach. I made a mental note to keep him close, just in case. The first night was quiet. Too quiet, actually. There was no sound from wildlife, no distant calls of owls or rustling in the underbrush, just an eerie stillness. Adam seemed to brush it off, talking about how it was just the time of year. Things slowed down in the woods as the colder months set in. We ate a simple dinner, laughed over beers, and eventually retired to our respective rooms. But I couldn't sleep. Max, usually the picture of calm at night, was restless too. He lay on the floor beside the bed, his eyes darting back and forth, his ears perked. Every so often, he would let out a soft growl, not loud enough to alarm Adam, but enough to make my skin prickle. I could feel the tension building in the air, like something was waiting. Around midnight, I finally got up. Max followed me to the window, pressing his nose to the glass. I stood beside him, looking out into the pitch-black woods. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and the distant silhouette of the mountains. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. My heart rate quickened as I scanned the darkness. Max's low growl broke the silence. His hackles were raised, and he was staring intently into the trees. I stepped back from the window, my pulse quickening, unsure of what he was reacting to. I listened closely but heard nothing. No footsteps, no rustling in the leaves. "Max, what's wrong?" I whispered. He didn't respond. He was still focused on the dark, as though he could see something I couldn't. After a few minutes, the feeling subsided, and I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. Maybe I had seen a shadow move in the wind or heard something in the woods that was completely natural. I went back to bed, trying to shake off the unease, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, things seemed normal, even if I still couldn't fully shake the feeling from the night before. Adam was already up, making coffee in the small kitchen. Max was more relaxed now, his usual energetic self as we ventured out into the woods for a short hike. The sunlight was beginning to filter through the trees, and the crisp air was refreshing. It was easy to forget the discomfort from the previous night. We spent the day exploring, walking down trails that led deeper into the forest. Max was in his element, running ahead and sniffing around with excitement. Felt like a normal day out in nature. But every time we took a break, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the trees just out of sight. But there was nothing, just the woods, thick and undisturbed. That evening, we lit a fire outside. Max curled up near my feet, content to relax after the long hike. The air had grown colder, and the shadows were stretching longer. As the fire crackled, I heard a noise in the woods. It wasn't a typical sound, though. It was a soft thump, as if something or someone was moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. I tensed, glancing at Adam. He was still fiddling with the fire, oblivious to the noise. Max's ears were up again, his eyes fixed on the trees. Another thump, closer this time. "Did you hear that?" I asked quietly. "Hear what?" Adam looked at me, his brow furrowed. "It's just the woods. Relax." I wanted to believe him, but the sound didn't sit right with me. It was too deliberate, like someone or something was walking around just out of sight, making sure we knew they were there. Max was on high alert now, his body tense and ready to spring into action. A sharp snap of a branch made me jump. Max let out a bark, low and threatening, and I stood up, instinctively moving between the noise and Adam. "Stay close," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Adam looked at me, finally understanding the seriousness in my tone. He grabbed a nearby flashlight, and we both stood still, listening. Nothing. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. We didn't talk much after that. Max had gone silent, watching the darkness. I felt a cold knot in my stomach, the feeling that whatever was out there had been watching us, waiting for something. That night, I locked the doors and windows, which was something I hadn't done before. I wasn't sure if it was paranoia or instinct, but the thought of something being close to the cabin kept me on edge. Max lay by the door, not sleeping, his eyes never leaving the shadows outside. I eventually fell into a restless sleep, but the night was far from peaceful. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the wind outside, felt amplified. Max stayed close, and I woke several times to find him standing by the window, staring into the woods. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a sound that I'll never forget. A slow, rhythmic tapping on the cabin's outer wall. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind racing. The tapping continued, methodical, almost like someone was knocking, but the sound was coming from the wall, not the door. It was too deliberate to be random. My breath caught in my throat as I looked at Max. He was staring at the door, his eyes wide and alert. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call Adam, but I didn't want to wake him. I didn't want to admit that I was scared. The tapping stopped. There was silence. Then, from the woods, a long, drawn-out howl echoed through the trees. Not an animal sound. Too human. I grabbed Max's collar and pulled him toward me, holding him tightly. The hair on my neck stood up, and every nerve in my body was on high alert. I had no idea what was out there, but I knew one thing. We weren't alone. In the morning, Adam found some tracks near the cabin, but they were strange, human-like, yet distorted, as if someone had been walking in shoes too big for them. They led toward the woods, then disappeared. We didn't stick around much longer. It felt wrong, as though something had marked the place. Max was nervous, more so than usual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been watched the entire time. We left that morning, not bothering to pack anything more than the essentials. I kept glancing over my shoulder as we drove away, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees, watching us leave. As we drove down the winding road, Max finally relaxed. He lay down in the back seat, his head resting on his paws. The tension that had been building for days seemed to lift. But deep down, I knew one thing for certain. We'd be avoiding that cabin in the woods from now on, and I wasn't sure I would ever truly feel safe again. It was one of those nights where the rain never stopped. Thick sheets of it came down hard, making the dark woods around me even darker, the sound of it drowning out nearly everything else. I sat inside the small cabin, the only source of light being the dull yellow glow of the lantern on the table beside me. It flickered slightly as the wind howled outside, pushing the rain against the windows like an endless barrage. The sound was constant, filling up the silence of the night, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I had taken this job a few months back. A simple gig, or at least that's what I thought. A seasonal ranger position, taking shifts at a remote cabin in the middle of the woods. The job was straightforward. Keep an eye on things, make sure no one was trespassing or poaching, and report anything unusual. The kind of work that mostly involved sitting around, occasionally checking the perimeter, and writing down anything worth noting in the logbook. The cabin itself was small, built from thick logs, meant to withstand the worst of the weather. A single room with a cot in the corner, a stove, a desk, and a radio for emergencies. The walls were lined with shelves holding old books and a few supplies. There was no running water, just a rain barrel outside, and the bathroom was an outhouse a few yards away. It wasn't much, but it did the job. Tonight was my first shift alone in the rain. I had been through quiet nights, cold nights, even long nights where the only thing keeping me company was the distant sound of owls or the rustling of branches in the wind. But this was different. The rain made everything feel heavier, like it was pressing down on the cabin, on me. I checked my watch. Almost midnight. I had another 6 hours before my shift ended. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the rain, trying to ignore the way it made the darkness outside seem even deeper. I had already done my rounds earlier in the evening, walking the perimeter with my flashlight, making sure everything was in order. There was nothing to report. No signs of people, no disturbances, just the forest, wet and quiet. I picked up the logbook and flipped through the pages. Most entries were the same. Weather conditions, occasional wildlife sightings, nothing out of the ordinary. The last entry from the previous ranger noted something about hearing noises near the tree line. Likely an animal. Still, I made a mental note of it. The wind picked up again, rattling the window. I glanced outside, but all I could see was darkness and the streaks of rain against the glass. I exhaled slowly and went back to my notes. Then I heard it, a noise, faint but distinct, somewhere outside. I sat still, listening, heart picking up pace. The rain made it hard to tell, but I was sure I had heard something beyond the wind and water. A rustling sound. I reached for my flashlight and stood up, careful to move slowly. The floor creaked under my weight as I stepped closer to the window. I couldn't see anything, but that didn't mean there was nothing there. Maybe a deer, maybe a branch breaking under the weight of the rain, but maybe not. I grabbed my jacket and slung it over my shoulders before unlocking the door. The moment I stepped outside, the cold hit me, sharp, cutting through my clothes. My boots sank slightly into the wet earth as I raised the flashlight and swept it across the clearing in front of the cabin. Nothing. The rain made it hard to see beyond a few yards. The trees stood tall, their branches heavy with water, swaying slightly in the wind. I moved forward slowly, scanning the area. Then I saw them. Footprints, fresh ones. They led from the tree line toward the cabin, stopping just a few feet away from where I stood. I swallowed hard, my pulse now hammering in my ears. The prints were deep, clear even in the mud. Someone had been here, recently. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, squinting, trying to see if there was anything, or anyone, out there. But all I saw was darkness and the endless rain. A part of me wanted to call it in, to use the radio and report it. But another part of me hesitated. What would I even say? Hey, I found some footprints in the rain. It wasn't much to go on. I followed the prints back to where they started, my boots sinking into the mud with each step. They disappeared into the thick brush at the edge of the woods. I stood there for a moment, scanning the trees, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. Then I heard it again. A sound, closer this time, a sharp crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. I turned sharply, my flashlight cutting through the dark. For a brief second, I thought I saw something move, a shadow shifting between the trees. I didn't wait. I turned back and headed straight for the cabin, stepping inside and locking the door behind me. My breath came fast as I leaned against the wood, listening. Silence, only the rain, but I knew someone was out there. I double-checked the lock and grabbed the rifle from the rack on the wall, just in case. I wasn't about to take any chances. I kept the flashlight in one hand, the rifle in the other, and moved toward the window. Nothing, but I didn't sit down. I didn't relax. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. And then, just before dawn, I saw it. The figure, standing just beyond the tree line, tall, unmoving, watching. I tightened my grip on the rifle, heart hammering. The rain made it hard to see, but they were there. Then, slowly, they turned and disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the shift. When the next ranger came to relieve me in the morning, I told them everything. Showed them the footprints, described what I had seen. We searched the area, but there was nothing left. No tracks, no signs of anyone. Just the wet ground and the endless trees. I quit the job a week later. I never found out who it was, what they wanted, or why they were watching. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone that night. It started with a favor. My uncle owned a hunting cabin deep in the woods of Montana, a good 40 miles from the nearest town. He'd built it in the late 80s as a getaway, a place to escape when life got too loud. It had no electricity, no running water, and only a wood stove for heat. The kind of place you went when you didn't want to be found. I'd been there a handful of times growing up, mostly tagging along with my dad when he and my uncle hunted elk. I never liked it much. Too quiet, too many shadows in the trees. The nights were long out there, stretched thin by the kind of silence that made your ears ring. Uncle Ray wasn't using the cabin much these days. His knees were shot, and he spent more time watching hunting shows than actually hunting. But he refused to sell it. Too much of myself in that place, he'd said. That's where I came in. He called me up in early October, said some out-of-towners had been messing around his property. Hunters, maybe, or kids with nothing better to do. Tracks in the dirt, a busted lock on the woodshed. Nothing taken, but it rattled him enough to ask if I'd go check it out. Stay a night or two if you want, he told me. Make sure everything's in one piece. I didn't have much going on. I was between jobs, recently single, and a little cash-strapped. He offered me a few hundred for the trouble, and that was good enough for me. I packed light, just my old .30-06 rifle, a sleeping bag, a few canned meals, and a case of bottled water. The drive out took most of the afternoon, the highway giving way to gravel roads, then dirt trails lined with pines. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. It looked the same as I remembered. A squat, one-room structure with a tin roof, its porch sagging under years of hard winters. The woodshed out back stood with its door hanging open. The lock snapped clean off. The cabin door was locked, though. That was a good sign. I did a quick sweep of the area before the light faded. Didn't see much, just some boot prints in the dirt near the shed. Might have been my uncle's from his last visit, might not. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old wood. The single cot was still made up, and the shelves held a few cans of soup and some bottled water. I lit the kerosene lantern and settled in for the night. It was colder than I expected. I got the wood stove going, heated a can of chili, and ate in the dim lantern glow. Outside, the woods pressed against the cabin like a solid wall. No wind, no crickets, just heavy silence. Then, around midnight, I heard something. A rustling. Not the wind, not an animal scurrying through the brush. It was deliberate, slow, like footsteps circling the cabin. I grabbed my rifle and killed the lantern, my heart thudding. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, barely breathing, waiting. Then something scratched at the door. Not knocking, scratching. Long, deliberate drags of something against the wood. I stayed completely still. The scratching stopped. For the next hour, I heard nothing. Eventually, I crawled into my sleeping bag, the rifle in arm's reach. Sleep didn't come easy. Morning came pale and cold. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, scanning the trees. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not boots. Bare feet. Human but wrong. The toes were too long, the arch too high. They led from the treeline to my porch, then back into the woods. A chill worked its way up my spine. I followed the tracks a little ways before they disappeared into the brush. Too many years in the woods told me this wasn't normal. I spent the day chopping wood, reinforcing the door with an extra plank, trying to shake the unease. But something was watching me. I could feel it. The air was too still. The birds were quiet. Even the squirrels seemed absent. I should have left, but something in me didn't want to back down. As the sun set, I built a bigger fire in the stove and loaded my rifle. That night, the noises came back. Footsteps circling the cabin. A low, guttural sound just beyond the trees. Then something spoke. It was my voice. A perfect imitation, drifting from the darkness. Let me in. I clenched the rifle so hard my fingers ached. It laughed. A dry, rattling chuckle, like someone choking on dust. I didn't sleep. I was done. At dawn, I packed my gear, doused the fire, and threw everything in the truck. But when I tried to start it, the engine wouldn't turn over. I popped the hood. Spark plugs were missing. Someone had taken them. I felt eyes on me, The woods were too quiet. I wasn't making it out in the truck. That left me with two options: wait for help or hike 20 miles to the nearest road. Waiting wasn't an option. I grabbed my rifle, a flashlight, and enough supplies to make the trek. I stuck to the dirt trail leading out, moving fast, trying not to think about what might be following. 3 miles in, I saw something, a man or something like one, standing in the trees ahead, tall, too tall, bones pressing against paper-thin skin. It grinned at me, then it moved. Not like a person, like a puppet with its strings cut. Fast, jittery, wrong. Asterisk, I ran. My boots pounded the dirt. My breath tore through my lungs. Then I heard it running too. Behind me, beside me, everywhere. Asterisk, a blur of movement in the trees. I raised the rifle and fired. The crack of the shot split the silence. Nothing.
Iran harder.
Mile after mile until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they'd burst. Then I saw it. The road. A truck was coming. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms, half sobbing. The driver, a rancher, slammed his brakes, jumping out. I barely got the words out. Something's in the woods. He didn't ask questions, just got me in the truck and drove. I never went back. A week later, my uncle called, said he drove up to the cabin to check it out, said the door was wide open, said something had trashed the place, said he found footprints.
Bare.
Human. Wrong. I told him to burn the cabin down. He didn't, but he never went back either. It was the kind of night that made you feel small and helpless, as if the world had just decided to swallow you whole. The rain poured down in sheets, a constant battering against the roof of the small, weathered cabin I had rented for a quiet weekend getaway. My name's Mike, and I'd come to this remote corner of the Appalachian Mountains to get away from the noise of the city, to reset after a long stretch at work, the kind of reset that you think will heal you, clear your head. The cabin was tucked away in the woods, far from any neighbors or signs of life. The road leading to it was nothing more than a rutted path that barely looked like it had been touched in years. I'd passed an old "no trespassing" sign halfway down, but it didn't bother me much. I was alone, no one would be wandering around. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and dampness. There was a fireplace in the corner, stacked high with enough firewood to last through the worst of the winter. The wooden floors creaked under my boots as I moved around, unpacking a small bag of food and a few supplies I thought I might need. I had no intention of leaving for the next 2 days. The weather was terrible, thick, relentless rain, and I figured it would be the perfect time to unwind. By the time the storm picked up, I had made myself comfortable in the armchair near the fire, sipping a bottle of whiskey I'd brought along. The wind outside howled, shaking the cabin and making the windows rattle. The fire crackled, and I closed my eyes for a second, letting the warmth sink into my bones. I wasn't sure how long I'd been sitting there when I heard it. A knock. It came from the back door, which was the only way in, aside from the front door, and I hadn't heard anyone approaching. I set the whiskey down on the small wooden table beside me and stood up. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I made my way to the door, wondering if I'd somehow missed a delivery or something. Another knock, louder this time, more insistent. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the only people who knew where I was were my sister and a couple of close friends. None of them had made any arrangements to come visit. My hand rested on the door handle, and I hesitated. The rain outside was relentless, and it was too damn cold to be out there for long. But then I heard it again, the sound of something scraping along the doorframe. Not a knock, more like fingers running along the wood. My heart skipped a beat. I pulled the door open just a crack, peering into the darkness beyond the porch. Nothing. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I'd imagined it, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt like I was being watched. A sense of unease settled over me, and I quickly closed the door, bolting it shut. My hands trembled slightly as I leaned back against the door, taking a breath. The rain pounded on, and the wind howled louder, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, in the woods, watching me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the wind, maybe, or an animal, but there was no denying that something felt off. I went back to the fireplace, trying to calm my nerves. The crackling fire seemed to do little to warm the cold chill that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The night dragged on, and I found myself looking out the window more than I should have, half expecting to see movement in the dark forest beyond. Then, just as I was starting to get lost in my thoughts, I heard it again, a low thud, like something heavy being dropped on the porch. I didn't move for a long moment, but the urge to investigate was too strong. Slowly, I rose from the armchair and walked over to the window. The rain blurred the view, but I could just make out the outline of something near the porch. I crept to the door again, slowly, cautiously. This time, I didn't open it all the way. Instead, I cracked it open just enough to peek outside. The porch was empty. The only thing out there was a small package, wrapped in brown paper. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a strange sense of foreboding. There was no note, no sign of who had left it, and no explanation for why it had been dropped there in the middle of a storm. I knew I should leave it alone, that it wasn't worth investigating, but I couldn't bring myself to just leave it there. What if it was important? What if someone was trying to get a message to me? Against my better judgment, I stepped out onto the porch, my boots sinking into the muddy ground as I approached the package. The rain was coming down harder now, the cold stinging my face as I picked it up. It was surprisingly light, almost as if there was nothing inside at all. I brought it back inside, setting it down on the table. I stared at it for a moment, my breath fogging up the air. Finally, I tore the paper away. Inside, there was a small, folded piece of paper. I hesitated before unfolding it, but when I did, my heart stopped. The message was simple, scrawled in hurried, shaky handwriting. "I see you." I froze, staring at the words. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was some sick joke, prankster neighbors, or someone who knew I was here. But something deep in my gut told me that wasn't the case. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to pack up and go, but it was too late for that. I knew someone was out there, watching, waiting. I quickly bolted the door again, pacing the small cabin in a frenzy. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. Should I call the police? No signal. No one was coming. A noise from outside caught my attention. A soft scraping sound, like something or someone dragging along the ground. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed, my ears straining. The sound grew louder, coming closer to the door, and I could hear the faintest of breaths, as if someone were standing just beyond the threshold. The seconds dragged on, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited, breathless. Then there was a knock. A single, deliberate knock. I stood there, my hands clammy, unsure of what to do. Should I open the door again? Was it just someone messing with me? Or was this the beginning of something much darker? Suddenly, the knock came again, this time louder and more forceful, as if the person on the other side knew I was there. I had to make a decision. I quickly ran to the small window beside the door and peered out, my heart skipping a beat when I saw nothing but the thick, pouring rain. But as I looked closer, I noticed something. A dark shape moving quickly in the shadows. I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest heavy object I could find, the iron poker from the fireplace, and stood by the door, waiting. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, to get out of there. But it was too late for that now. Whoever was out there had already found me. The knock came again, but this time it wasn't just a knock. It was a banging, hard and fast, as if the person was trying to break in. I tightened my grip on the poker, my knuckles white, waiting. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. Then suddenly the banging stopped. Silence. I stayed still for what felt like an eternity, my body tense, my heart racing. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor, coming closer. A shadow passed in front of the window. I wasn't alone. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to think of something, anything, to do. I was trapped in this small cabin with no way out. And then the door handle turned. The door opened, but I was ready. I swung the iron poker with all my strength, hearing a sickening thud as it connected with something or someone on the other side. The door slammed shut, and I heard a muffled curse, followed by a low growl. The handle twisted again, but this time I didn't hesitate. I threw my weight against the door, holding it shut with everything I had, my body trembling. It didn't matter how much I tried to hold it closed. The pressure from the other side was too much, and I could feel myself losing ground. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the pressure stopped. The door swung open, but there was no one there. Nothing. The silence stretched on, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't until I heard the soft thud of something falling to the floor, something wet and heavy, that I dared to look outside. The porch was empty, except for the package that had been left for me, and the dark red smear on the ground. I didn't wait around to see what else was coming. I gathered what I could, left the cabin behind, and never looked back. It's been years since that night, and I can still feel the weight of those words, "I see you." But what I never understood was, who exactly was out there, and why hadn't they finished the job? I never thought I'd look back at that weekend as the worst mistake of my life. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a break from work, from stress, from the dull weight of routine. Just me, my wife, and her stepmom, spending a couple of nights in a cabin deep in the woods. I should have known better. My wife, Emily, had been the one to plan it. She thought it would be good for us to unwind, to disconnect from the world for a bit. And since her stepmom, Lisa, had recently lost her husband, Emily's dad, she figured it would be nice to bring her along. Lisa had been struggling with grief, and maybe fresh air and a change of scenery would help. We left on a Friday afternoon in my truck, packed with supplies, food, extra clothes, a couple of lanterns, and my hunting knife, just in case. The drive took us about 4 hours, most of it through winding back roads that cut through dense pine forests. As we got deeper into the woods, the road turned to dirt, the trees pressing in from both sides. It felt like we were leaving civilization behind. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single-story wooden structure with a wraparound porch, an old stone fireplace, and a small dock that stretched out over a nearby lake. No electricity, no running water, just a wood-burning stove and an old hand pump in the kitchen for water. I parked the truck beside the cabin and killed the engine. For a moment, we just sat there, listening to the absolute silence around us. No cars, no voices, nothing but the distant sound of the wind in the trees. Something about that silence made me uneasy. Lisa was the first to get out. She stretched her arms, looking up at the trees with a small, tired smile. "It's peaceful," she said. Emily climbed out next, breathing in the crisp air. "Yeah, it's perfect." I grabbed our bags and followed them inside. The cabin smelled of dust and old wood, the kind of scent that clung to places left untouched for too long. I dropped the bags in the main room and lit a lantern while Emily and Lisa checked out the rest of the place. There were 2 bedrooms, one for me and Emily, and a smaller one for Lisa. The bathroom was just an outhouse a few yards from the cabin, which wasn't ideal, but we could deal with it for a couple of days. We settled in, unpacking our things, setting up the lanterns. The plan was simple: cook dinner, have a couple of drinks, and turn in early. But something about the air in that cabin made me restless. Maybe it was the isolation, or the way the trees outside seemed too still, too quiet. I shook it off. Night fell quickly out there. With no city lights, the darkness was absolute, pressing in against the windows like a heavy curtain. We ate by lantern light, the flames flickering against the log walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees. After dinner, I stepped outside for a smoke. The air was cold, crisp. The lake was a black mirror, reflecting the moon and stars. I stood on the porch, listening. Then I heard something, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on leaves. I turned my head, scanning the tree line. Nothing, just darkness and shadows. Still, the feeling of unease settled deeper in my gut. I flicked my cigarette away and went back inside, locking the door behind me. Emily and Lisa were in the main room, playing a game of cards by the lantern. I tried to shake the feeling, but something about the night felt wrong. I didn't sleep well that night. The bed was comfortable enough, but my mind wouldn't settle. I kept waking up, listening to the night, hearing things. At one point, I thought I heard something move outside, a slow, dragging sound near the porch. I told myself it was just an animal. But then, just as I was drifting back to sleep, I heard something else. A soft, deliberate knock on the cabin door. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. For a long time, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting. But there was no second knock, no sound of movement, just silence. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I slipped into uneasy sleep. The next morning was cold and gray. I stepped outside to grab some firewood and froze. The ground outside the porch was covered in tracks. Footprints, barefoot. The prints led from the tree line to the porch, then back into the woods. I stared at them for a long time, my mind struggling to make sense of it. They were human, but they weren't right. The toes were too long, the shape slightly off. I didn't say anything to Emily or Lisa. No point in scaring them. We spent the day exploring the woods, hiking along the lake. The air was cool, but the deeper we went into the trees, the more I felt it. That same creeping unease. At one point, Lisa stopped and turned in a slow circle, looking around. "Do you feel that?" she asked. I nodded. Something was watching us. We headed back to the cabin earlier than planned. I kept my hunting knife on me the whole time, my grip tightening on the handle whenever I heard a twig snap or leaves rustle. By the time night fell, I was on edge. That night, it happened again. The knocking, slow, soft, deliberate. I sat up in bed, my pulse pounding. Emily stirred beside me but didn't wake. I reached for my knife. The knocking came again. I stood, moving quietly through the cabin. The lantern was still burning low in the main room, casting long shadows against the walls. I crept to the door and pressed my ear against it. Silence. Then the door handle rattled. My heart nearly stopped. I gripped the knife tighter. The handle stopped moving. I stood there for what felt like forever, barely breathing. Finally, I forced myself to look out the window. Something stood at the edge of the trees, tall, thin, barefoot, his head tilted slightly as if listening. I backed away from the window. I didn't sleep after that. We should have left that morning. I should have packed our things and driven away, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. By nightfall, The air inside the cabin was thick with tension. Lisa felt it too. She barely spoke during dinner, her eyes flicking toward the windows. I sat by the door, my knife in my lap. Then the knocking came again. Not at the door this time, at the bedroom window. Lisa let out a sharp breath. Emily went pale. We didn't move. Then, a slow scraping sound against the wood. It was right outside. I didn't wait. I grabbed Emily's arm, yanked Lisa to her feet. We're leaving. Now. I grabbed the keys, threw open the door, and froze. Something was standing on the porch. Tall, thin, wrong. I slammed the door shut, locked it. It didn't try to break in. It just stood there, waiting. I don't remember much after that. Just the three of us huddled in the main room, the lantern burning low, listening. At some point, the sound stopped. By dawn, it was gone. We left everything behind, just ran for the truck and drove. I don't know what we saw out there, but sometimes late at night I still hear it. That slow, deliberate knocking. I had always found peace in the woods, away from the noise of the city and the constant buzz of modern life. This secluded cabin, tucked deep in the Appalachian hills, had become my refuge. My cousin, Jared, had just finished his medical studies, and we thought this cabin would be the perfect place to spend a quiet weekend. He needed a break from the pressures of school, and I, having always loved the solitude of the woods, was more than happy to join him. The cabin was old, built in the early 70s by my great-grandfather. It had a rustic charm, with exposed beams in the ceiling and a stone fireplace that crackled to life with every log we threw in. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a scent I had grown fond of during my childhood. Jared and I spent the first few hours unpacking and setting up the place, catching up on life and laughing about old memories. It had been a while since we'd spent time together, and it felt good to be around family again. That night, as the fire in the hearth burned low, we sat by the window, watching the rain hit the glass in sheets. The storm had picked up quickly, and it felt like the entire world had been swallowed by the thick, damp fog that rolled in from the valley below. It was the kind of storm that made the trees outside bend and groan in the wind, and the kind that made you feel small, as if the earth itself was pressing in on you. Jared was studying medical journals by the dim light of an oil lamp. He'd brought stacks of books and notes to keep up with his studies, even though he promised he'd take it easy. I knew he was anxious to finish his degree, but I couldn't understand why he insisted on studying during our trip. I thought he'd at least try to unwind. I was distracted, watching the storm rage outside when I heard him mutter something under his breath. At first, I thought he was just tired, but then I caught the unease in his voice. "Hey, you all right?" I asked, turning to him. He looked up from his book, eyes wide with surprise. "Yeah, it's just, I found something weird in one of my notes. I don't remember writing this." His words hung in the air for a moment, and I couldn't shake the chill creeping up my spine. He showed me the page, but there was nothing there. Just a line he had underlined several times. "A patient's heart rate drops too quickly." Why? What did I miss? I didn't know what to say. Jared had always been meticulous with his notes. He was the kind of person who triple-checked everything, especially something as important as medical records. The fact that he didn't remember writing it was strange. But what bothered me more was how rattled he seemed. I could see it in his face, the same look he got when something didn't add up. I don't remember," he said, his voice shaking a little. "I swear, this wasn't in here before." I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe he was just overtired. But the more I looked at the page, the more unsettled I became. The storm outside had grown worse, and now the wind was howling through the trees, making the cabin creak and groan like it was alive. It was as if the world itself was closing in on us. Jared stayed up late that night, going over his notes and textbooks, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing strange sounds coming from outside, branches snapping in the wind, the low hum of something moving in the distance. I tried to convince myself it was just the storm, but something felt off. The cabin felt too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, it was dawn. I woke up to find Jared missing. His medical books were still scattered around the cabin, and the fire had burned out. The storm had passed, leaving the woods outside eerily still. I called out to him, but there was no response. I stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with mist. I walked around the cabin, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. I checked the woods near the cabin, thinking he might have gone for a walk to clear his head, but I found nothing. Just the dense fog and the wet earth beneath my boots. It wasn't until I reached the old barn at the far end of the property that I heard a noise. A faint, muffled cry coming from inside. My pulse quickened as I approached, my hands trembling with fear. The door to the barn was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I felt a wave of cold air rush past me, like something was waiting inside. What I found in that barn will haunt me for the rest of my life. Jared was lying on the ground, unconscious but breathing, his face pale and drawn. But it was the sight next to him that made my blood run cold. There, on the barn floor, were dozens of small, scattered medical tools, scalpels, syringes, needles, all arranged in a strange, almost ritualistic pattern. It was as if someone had been experimenting with them, trying to figure out how they worked, but there was no explanation for what I was seeing. I rushed to Jared's side, shaking him awake. When he finally opened his eyes, his expression was one of complete confusion. He didn't remember how he ended up in the barn, nor did he remember the tools. "Is this real?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Did I do this?" I didn't know what to say. I helped him to his feet, but the entire situation felt surreal. I was starting to doubt my own sanity, questioning whether I had imagined the whole thing. We spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to make sense of what had happened. Jared couldn't remember anything about the medical tools or why he had been in the barn. The only thing that seemed to connect it all was the note he had found the night before, the one that had seemed so out of place. Later that evening, after hours of silence between us, Jared confessed something. He said he had been having strange dreams while studying, dreams of his medical school days, of patients he had worked on, of surgeries gone wrong. He felt as though something had been driving him, pushing him to keep studying even when he didn't want to. That's when it hit me. I had seen this kind of obsession before in other people, but I never thought it would happen to him. Jared had been so consumed by his studies that he had pushed himself too far. The strange note, the tools in the barn, it was all a result of his mind unraveling under the pressure. The more he focused on his work, the more disconnected he became from reality. He hadn't intentionally gone mad, but the pressure, the sleepless nights, the relentless focus on his studies had pushed him to the edge. We left the cabin the next morning, leaving behind the confusion and the dread that had settled in. Jared promised he would seek help, that he would take a break from his medical studies. I didn't know if he would follow through, but I hoped he would, for his sake and mine. The woods were still quiet as we drove away, the fog lifting with the rising sun. I never wanted to return to that cabin again. It had been a place of refuge once, but now it felt like a prison, a reminder of how easily the mind can break under pressure. As for Jared, he kept his word. He took time off from school and sought help from a counselor. It wasn't an easy road, but with time, he found his way back. It wasn't a perfect recovery, but it was progress. The cabin, though, still stands, abandoned now like so many other places in the woods. I can still remember the strange feeling of walking through it, the way it felt like the walls were closing in. Maybe I was just imagining things, but I don't think I'll ever forget that weekend. The rain started early that day, not the kind that makes you want to cozy up with a book, but the kind that feels heavy, like it might never stop. By the time I pulled into the ranger's cabin, the wind had begun to pick up. The forest around me looked different under the thick gray sky, branches swaying, leaves rattling like bones. I didn't mind the isolation. As a park ranger, you get used to it. But there's something about being out here in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense trees, that makes you uneasy sometimes. I was stationed at the small ranger cabin in the backwoods of Tennessee for a couple of weeks. It wasn't the busiest part of the park. Not a lot of hikers or tourists ventured this far, which was fine by me. It gave me time to catch up on paperwork, clean the cabin, and enjoy the peace. But as the day turned into night, that peace started to feel less like a comfort and more like an omen. The cabin was small, one room with a loft for sleeping. It was old, built decades ago, but it had its charm. A wood stove sat in the corner, the smell of the fresh pine logs from the fire mixing with the earthy scent of the forest outside. I got the fire going early, hoping it would help keep the chill from seeping into my bones. The cabin was sturdy enough, but the storm outside was relentless. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees like something alive. The radio crackled with static, cutting through the silence of the cabin as I tried to settle in for the night. There was no one else in the area, no other rangers on duty. I was alone, and the sound of the storm outside was beginning to drown out everything else. I tried to focus on my book, but every now and then, the wind would shift, and it sounded like something else was out there. Something other than the usual rustling of leaves. I told myself it was just the storm, but deep down, I knew something felt off. The night dragged on. I moved from the couch to the table, scribbling down a few notes. The wind was picking up again, the howling louder now, almost like it was circling the cabin. I glanced out the window, but it was too dark to see anything beyond the rain. Just the blur of wet trees and the occasional flash of lightning. The storm was growing worse by the minute. Around 11:30 p.m., the power flickered and went out. It wasn't uncommon during storms like this, and I wasn't worried. I had a lantern on the table and enough flashlights to light up a small town. I went over to the window to see if I could spot any downed power lines or fallen trees. That's when I noticed something strange. A shadow, just outside the tree line. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was there, moving slowly through the rain. My first instinct was that it was an animal, a deer or maybe a bear, but something didn't feel right. The shadow wasn't the shape of an animal, not really. It was too tall, too thin. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and stepped out onto the porch, the rain instantly soaking through my jacket. I scanned the area with the beam of light, but the shadow was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the storm. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The wind howled through the trees again, louder now, as if urging me to stay inside. I hesitated for a moment, but eventually I stepped back inside and locked the door behind me. I could hear the steady thrum of the rain on the roof, and I tried to focus on that, let it drown out the creeping feeling that something was wrong. A few hours later, the storm had not let up. I was getting ready to turn in for the night when I heard it again. A soft scraping noise coming from the back of the cabin. I froze. The noise stopped, then started up again, faint but persistent. I walked slowly toward the back door, flashlight in hand. The sound was coming from the corner, near the small woodshed. I could hear the wind, but there was something else too, something that didn't belong. It was as if the woodshed was being disturbed, something or someone was moving around back there. I unlocked the door and swung it open, stepping out into the rain once more. The wind whipped around me, but I forced myself to focus. The corner of the cabin was empty, the woodshed silent. I walked around it, checking the perimeter, but there was nothing. No sign of anything unusual. Nothing but the endless rain and the distant roar of the storm. I wasn't sure what to make of it. The noise could have been an animal, maybe a raccoon or something small, but it didn't feel like that. The wind had picked up again, and the trees groaned under the pressure. I decided to lock up and head back inside, but just as I turned to go, I saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible through the rain. It was a person. At least it looked like one. I couldn't make out any features, but the figure was standing still, watching me. My heart started pounding in my chest, and my instincts told me to get back inside. I sprinted toward the door, slammed it shut behind me, and locked it. I grabbed my radio to contact the park office, but there was nothing but static. The storm was blocking the signal. My mind raced. Who would be out there? And why weren't they coming closer? I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I was overreacting. Could have been someone lost, a hiker who wandered off the trail. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The night stretched on, the storm showing no signs of letting up. I barely slept, every little noise making me jump. The wind howled, the trees creaked, and the rain never stopped. But there was something else too, a sense of being watched, like I wasn't alone. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see the figure again, but it never appeared. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. By morning, the storm had finally started to subside. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and the wind died down. I was exhausted, but I knew I had to check the area. The radio still wasn't working, and I needed to make sure nothing had happened overnight. I grabbed my gear and headed outside, the wet earth squelching beneath my boots. The world was quiet now, the usual sounds of the forest muted after the storm. As I approached the back of the cabin, I spotted something strange in the mud, a set of footprints. Not human, but too large to be an animal. They looked fresh, like they had been made just hours before. I followed the prints, heart hammering in my chest, until they led me to the edge of the woods. There, hidden in the underbrush, I found what I'd been dreading, a large knife covered in mud and rainwater. It was coated in something dark and sticky, blood. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I had no idea who or what had been out there last night, but I was certain now that I wasn't just dealing with an animal. Someone had been watching me, and I had no idea if they were still out there. I made the decision to leave, packing up quickly. The storm had passed, but the tension in the air lingered. As I left the cabin behind, I kept looking over my shoulder, every shadow seeming to move. The only thing I could think of was getting back to the ranger station and reporting what I'd found. By the time I got back to the main office, I was shaking. I told the supervisor everything, and we contacted local authorities to investigate. They found no signs of anyone near the cabin, no trace of anyone who might have been lurking in the woods. But the knife, the blood, it was real. They never found out who was out there that night, and the incident was eventually chalked up to some kind of freak accident or a prank gone wrong. But I never returned to that cabin. The park was vast, and there were other stations to work at. The woods held their secrets, and I wasn't willing to pry any deeper. Every so often, when the rain starts to fall hard, I remember that night, the shadow in the trees, the scrape against the cabin, the feeling that something was watching me. And I still wonder, was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there something more out there? Something that would never be found? It was late fall in the small town of Ashford, a place tucked away between dense forests and rolling hills in the northwest. The trees were barren, their skeletal branches stretching high, reaching toward the gray sky like silent witnesses. Fog hung low, curling around the roads and creeping between the old buildings. I'd never liked Ashford. There was something eerie about it, even in the daylight, but it was a place my family had known for generations, and now I was staying there for a short while to help clear out my great-uncle's cabin. I was 25, the youngest of my siblings, and always the one chosen to take on odd jobs like this. It wasn't glamorous, but I didn't mind. I liked being alone, in places that felt untouched by time or other people. The cabin had been abandoned for years after my great-uncle's death. He'd lived there quietly, a recluse, and now his belongings, old and covered in dust, were mine to sort through. I'd been to the cabin before when I was younger, but only for short visits, never overnight. This time, I was alone for the first time, and something about the place felt different. The cabin was situated on a small plot of land on the outskirts of the town, right next to an old cemetery. The graves had been there for centuries, the stones weathered and cracked, many unreadable. People whispered about the cemetery, and I had always heard strange things growing up. Stories of shadows moving between the gravestones, and of the old caretaker who had supposedly vanished without a trace. But those were just stories, I thought. It was around 7 in the evening when I arrived, the sun dipping below the horizon and the world turning cold and quiet. The sky was overcast, and the air felt thick, like it might rain. The cabin sat at the edge of the property, the front door hanging slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I stepped out of my car, feeling the chill bite into my skin, and grabbed my bags from the back seat. The ground was soft, the grass damp from recent rainfall. I pulled my jacket tighter and walked up to the cabin, the gravel crunching under my boots. Inside, the cabin was just as I remembered it, though more rundown. Dust coated every surface, and the floor creaked underfoot with every step. There were old wooden beams on the ceiling, their wood darkened with age, and the fireplace was covered in a thick layer of soot. I set my bags down and lit the fireplace, its warmth slowly filling the room. The glow from the flames flickered across the walls, casting dancing shadows. As I unpacked and settled in, I could hear the wind picking up outside, whistling through the cracks in the windows and shaking the trees. The cemetery next door seemed even quieter than usual, a heavy stillness hanging over it. I decided to take a walk, stretch my legs after the drive, and get a feel for the place. The path to the cemetery was just a short distance from the cabin, and I could see the old gravestones through the mist. They stood like sentinels, their surfaces worn, leaning slightly with age. I walked along the iron fence that separated the property from the cemetery, my boots crunching on the gravel path. The wind was growing stronger, the fog thicker, and the air was now cold enough to see my breath. It was almost as if the world around me was holding its breath. As I neared the farthest corner of the cemetery, I saw something strange, a small, dilapidated structure in the distance. At first, I thought it might be another gravestone or a small mausoleum, but as I walked closer, I realized it was a cabin, just like the one I was staying in. It was much smaller, though, and the roof was nearly caved in, the walls covered in moss and vines. I approached cautiously, my heart starting to beat a little faster. There was something unnerving about it, but I couldn't place why. I circled the cabin, looking for a door or window. The back of the building had a large wooden door that was ajar, and I pushed it open with a creak. Inside, the air was damp and musty, and the floor was covered in rotting leaves and debris. A faint smell of decay lingered in the air. I could barely make out the shape of an old chair, overturned in the corner, and a broken table. But it was what I found next that made my skin crawl. On the far wall, there was a collection of drawings, charcoal sketches that were smeared with age. The images were crude but chilling, depicting twisted faces and dark shapes that seemed to move in the dim light. I stepped closer to examine them, but as I did, I heard a sound from behind me, a soft shuffle, like something dragging across the ground. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there, just the emptiness of the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. Maybe it was just the wind or my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. I stepped back, out of the cabin, and slammed the door behind me, the sound echoing in the still night. I made my way back to the main cabin, walking quickly, my mind racing. It was only when I reached the front door that I realized how cold I had gotten, my fingers numb from the chill. I locked the door behind me and lit the fireplace again, trying to calm my nerves. The night wore on, and the storm outside grew worse. Rain began to pour in heavy sheets, hammering against the windows. The wind howled through the trees, and the cabin groaned with the pressure of the storm. I tried to distract myself by going through some of my great-uncle's old belongings. Boxes of papers, books, photographs. But every time I heard a creak or a groan from the cabin, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The bed was old, the mattress lumpy, but I was too tired to care. I pulled the covers over myself and tried to sleep, but the sound of the storm outside kept me awake. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, a low, scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. It was coming from the kitchen, just down the hall. I lay still, my breath shallow. The wind outside was louder than the sound, but there was no mistaking it. It was real. Someone or something was in the cabin with me. My heart raced as I slowly reached for the flashlight beside the bed, my hand trembling. I had to be sure. I had to know what was going on. I stood up, quietly, and crept down the hallway toward the kitchen. The sound was louder now, and I could feel my pulse in my ears. I slowly pushed the door open. Nothing. The kitchen was empty. The door to the basement was ajar, but nothing was out of place. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard it again. A scraping sound, but this time it was closer, coming from the basement. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I moved toward the basement door, but the hairs on my neck stood on end. The floor creaked beneath my feet, louder than before. I opened the door and shone the flashlight into the darkness below. The beam of light caught something, a shadow darting across the room, disappearing into the corner of the basement. I didn't wait to investigate further. I bolted upstairs, locked every door, and barricaded myself in the bedroom. The storm outside was still raging, but my mind was focused on one thing. I wasn't alone in the cabin. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, every sound making me jump, every shadow feeling like a threat. But when the first light of dawn finally filtered through the windows, I dared to leave the bedroom. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the air felt thick with tension. The storm had passed, but the weight of the night remained. I didn't find anything in the basement, nothing but dust and cobwebs. But when I went to the cemetery later that morning, I found something that chilled me to the bone. There, at the edge of the old graveyard, was a fresh grave. The dirt was still loose, and there was no marker, just a mound of earth that didn't belong. That was when I understood. The stories about the caretaker, about the strange happenings in the cemetery, they weren't just stories. I had walked into something much darker than I could have imagined. I left Ashford that day, driving away from the cabin and the cemetery, and I never looked back. The feeling that had haunted me lingered, like a shadow following me. But I would never forget what I found, or what I didn't find, in that graveyard. And I would never return to that cabin again. The mystery of that night, and what I had felt, would stay with me forever. I'd learned too late that some places are better left undisturbed. It was the kind of storm that made you feel small and insignificant. The wind howled outside, its voice rising and falling in waves, battering the cabin with the relentless force of nature. The rain came down in sheets, slapping against the windows, forcing me to squint through the glass just to make out anything beyond the flickering lantern light inside. I had been working here for weeks, alone. It wasn't the first time I had been out here, but tonight felt different. Felt like the storm was alive, angry and waiting. The cabin was small, just a wooden structure with a single room, a small kitchen, and a loft for sleeping. The walls were lined with shelves holding tools, dried food, and a few books. There was a fireplace in one corner, with a pile of chopped wood stacked neatly beside it. I had started working as a woodsman's assistant a few months ago, and this job was the worst part, night shifts alone in this cabin. I had no choice. The money was good, and it was only temporary, so I pushed through it, convincing myself that I could handle it. But tonight, something was different. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was the silence. Normally, there was the occasional rustling of animals outside, the crackling of the fire or the wind, but tonight it was just still, too still. The storm had been raging for hours, but it didn't feel like it was going to stop anytime soon. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and stoked the fire, trying to push the unease aside. The heat from the flames did little to fight off the chill creeping through the cabin. The lantern on the table flickered in time with the wind's howls, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. I had been here long enough to know the layout of the cabin inside and out, but tonight I felt like I was seeing it for the first time. Every creak of the floorboards, every snap of a twig outside, made me jump. I tried to tell myself it was just the storm, but something gnawed at me in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't put my finger on it. I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. There was a small porch at the front, just a few feet from the door. I grabbed a flashlight, flicked it on, and stepped outside. The wind hit me hard, pushing against my chest, but I didn't let it deter me. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, sweeping across the cabin's edges. The trees around the cabin bent under the pressure of the wind, their branches scratching the roof like fingers trying to get in. I moved around the cabin, checking the usual spots. The windows, the door, the back. Everything seemed fine, but there was one thing that felt off. The shed in the back. I had locked it earlier, but now I couldn't remember if I had left it secured properly. The last thing I wanted was to deal with any wild animals getting inside. I walked toward the shed, my boots crunching on the wet earth. The light flickered, and I felt a cold breeze brush against my neck, sending a shiver down my spine. The shed door was slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. Inside, everything was still. Nothing seemed out of place. I checked the tools and equipment, making sure everything was in order. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A dark shape in the corner of the shed. I couldn't make it out at first, but then I saw it more clearly. A large, old, leather bag. It wasn't mine. It wasn't supposed to be there. I knelt down, my heart racing, and reached for it. The bag was heavy, worn, and covered in mud. I opened it slowly, feeling a sense of dread build in my chest. Inside were old, weathered books, some kind of strange artifacts, and a few scraps of paper. One paper stood out, though. It was yellowed with age, and as I unfolded it, I saw that it was a map. The map wasn't of any place I recognized, no town, no landmarks I had seen before. It looked like a drawn-out version of the area surrounding the cabin, but with strange markings scattered throughout. I felt my stomach churn. Why would someone leave this here? It didn't make sense. I quickly shoved the map back into the bag and zipped it up. But as I was about to close the shed door, I heard a rustling sound from behind me. I froze. It was a soft sound, but enough to make my heart stop. I turned slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. There, in the dark, stood a figure. A tall, thin figure, almost blending into the shadows. I couldn't make out much, but I could see the outline of a person just standing there watching me. I froze. The air around me felt colder suddenly, like I was being suffocated by the weight of the storm. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, couldn't breathe. My mind raced. Was it an animal? Person? Something else? Couldn't tell. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I slammed the shed door shut and locked it, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the key. I ran back to the cabin, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. The wind howled louder, like the storm was mocking me. When I reached the door, I slammed it shut behind me, locking it quickly. I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breath, but my mind was a mess. Was I just imagining things? Had I been out in the storm too long? Or was something really out there? The map, the strange figure, it didn't add up. None of it did. I tried to shake off the fear, but it clung to me, tight and suffocating. I needed to stay calm. I needed to think. I grabbed a drink of water, trying to clear my head, but when I looked back at the fire, I froze. The map, it was sitting on the table. I hadn't brought it inside. I had left it in the shed. My stomach lurched. I didn't know how it had gotten there, but I knew I hadn't placed it there. I glanced around the room, every shadow now looking like something waiting to pounce. The fire crackled in the corner, but the warmth did nothing to chase away the cold that had settled in my bones. I stood up slowly, every muscle tense, my hand reaching for the lantern on the table. The room was unnervingly quiet now, the storm outside still raging but muted by the thick walls of the cabin. I felt like I was being watched again, and this time I couldn't convince myself it was just the storm. Something was out there. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from the back of the cabin, a sound like something had slammed against the wall. I spun around, my heart racing. The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from inside the cabin. I crept toward the back room, the floorboards creaking under my weight. My breath caught in my throat when I saw what had caused the noise. The door to the loft was open. I hadn't left it open. Slowly, I stepped toward it, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I hesitated, but then the wind picked up again, louder this time, almost like it was calling to me. The door creaked, and I stepped inside, feeling the cold air rush past me as I climbed the stairs. At the top, I saw it. The figure. It was standing in the corner of the loft, staring at me with dark, hollow eyes. Its clothes were tattered, its skin pale and covered in dirt. It looked human, but something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, just as I thought I would pass out from the fear, the figure collapsed to the floor in a heap. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, my thoughts scattered. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to get out. But I couldn't. It wasn't until I saw it again, the leather bag, sitting on the floor beside the figure, that I realized the truth. It had never left. When the police arrived the next morning, they found me curled up by the fire, exhausted and in shock. The storm had finally passed, but the truth hadn't. The map, the strange figure, the sudden appearance of the bag, everything made sense now. I had stumbled across something I wasn't supposed to see. The woodsman's job had been more than just cutting trees. The cabin wasn't just a place to stay. It was a place to keep things hidden, and I had unknowingly crossed a line that I shouldn't have. As for the figure in the loft, they said it was just a man who had gone mad after spending too much time out there. The bag was full of old documents, maps to places people didn't want to be found. But they never figured out how it got there that night or who put it in the shed. I couldn't stay. The cabin was no longer just a job. It was a place full of secrets, and some things are better left undiscovered. It was a cold night in late November when I found myself in the woods. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the wind, and the ground was covered in a thin layer of frost that crunched beneath my boots. I had never liked the woods, especially not at night, but I had little choice. This was the job. It was supposed to be simple, but as the hours dragged on, I realized just how wrong I was. I had been hired to watch over the cabin for a few days, a simple task for a decent pay. The owners, an older couple, had been gone for the week to visit their children, and they wanted someone to keep an eye on the place. I had taken the job without much thought. After all, it wasn't the first time I'd done something like this. I'd spent nights alone in cabins before. The solitude rarely bothered me. But this cabin, it was different. I drove out to the place in the late afternoon, the sun dipping low in the sky by the time I arrived. The cabin was situated in the middle of a thick forest, far from the nearest town. A long gravel road led up to it, winding through the trees, the kind of road where you couldn't help but feel isolated as you drove. The cabin itself was an old, two-story structure made of weathered wood, with a porch that sagged under the weight of time. It looked like it had been there for decades, the paint peeling off in places, and the roof covered with patches of moss. I remember walking up to the front door, feeling a strange unease settle in my stomach. It wasn't the kind of feeling that came from fear, but more like something was off about the place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, that I was overthinking it. After all, the couple had seemed perfectly normal, and the cabin was just an old house. Once inside, I got to work, making sure everything was locked up tight. I checked the windows, the doors, and the fireplace. The place was well kept, but there was an odd sense of abandonment in the air, as if no one had really lived here for years. The furniture was old, but it was sturdy. The kitchen was stocked with food, though it looked like it had been there a while. I set up camp in the living room, starting a fire in the hearth to stave off the cold. Crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the windows and making the trees groan as they swayed. It wasn't long before the storm hit. Heavy rain started pouring down, the sound of it pelting against the roof loud enough to drown out everything else. As the night wore on, the storm only grew worse. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain fell in sheets, creating a constant, drumming noise. The fire in the hearth flickered and crackled, and I found myself staring into the flames, lost in thought. It was easy to let the mind wander when you were alone in a place like this. The flickering firelight seemed to bring out memories of other times I had been alone, other cabins in other forests. But tonight was different. Around midnight, I heard something that broke my concentration. A sound, faint but distinct, coming from the back of the cabin. It was a soft thud, followed by a dragging noise. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something else rummaging around. But then the dragging sound came again, this time louder and closer. I got up, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked toward the back of the cabin, where the noise was coming from. The hallway was dim, lit only by the weak glow of the fire in the living room. I walked cautiously, my boots making no sound on the creaky wooden floor. When I reached the back door, I hesitated. Should I open it? Should I look outside? The rain was still coming down in torrents, and the wind howled like some kind of wild beast. But curiosity pushed me forward. I slowly turned the knob, pushing the door open just enough to peek outside. First, I saw nothing. The world beyond the door was a blur of rain and shadow, the trees bending and swaying in the storm. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw something, a figure dragging something along the ground. The figure was tall, hunched over, and moving slowly, dragging a large, heavy object behind them. I felt my stomach drop. What was going on? Who was out there in the middle of the storm? Why was someone dragging something in the rain? I stepped back from the door, my mind racing. I knew I had to make a decision. Should I go out there? Should I call for help? But my phone had no signal, and there was no one for miles. I was completely alone. The figure outside seemed to stop, just as if it had sensed my presence. For a moment, everything was still. The wind had died down, and the rain was no longer a constant roar. I stood frozen, not knowing what to do. Then, without warning, the figure turned around. I saw their face. It was pale, almost ghostly, and their eyes were wide and unblinking, like they were staring straight into my soul. For a moment, I couldn't move. It was like my body had frozen in place, unable to do anything but watch. And then the figure did something that made my blood run cold. They smiled. A twisted, unnatural grin spread across their face, and the object they were dragging, now that I could see it clearly, was a body. A dead body, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, its face frozen in an expression of terror. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know what to do. Who was this person? What were they doing? Why were they here? I tried to calm myself down, sitting down on the floor, leaning against the wall. I needed to think. I needed to figure out what the hell was going on. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I couldn't tell anymore. The storm raged on outside, and I sat there in the dark, waiting. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Had I imagined it? Had it been a figment of my imagination? A trick of the storm? No, I had seen it. I had seen that face. And then I heard it. A knock came from the back door. Knock, knock, knock. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was on the other side of that door wasn't in a hurry. They were waiting for something, or perhaps they were waiting for me to make a move. I couldn't just sit here forever. I had to act. I had to get out of this place. But the storm outside was relentless. If I ran out into it, I wouldn't get far. I knew the forest, and I knew how easy it was to get lost in the thick woods. I wouldn't survive out there alone in the dark, with no shelter, no warmth, and no way to know where I was going. So I stayed put. I waited, hoping the figure would leave, hoping the knocking would stop. But it didn't. Hours passed, and the knocking continued, growing louder with each passing minute. The figure outside didn't leave. I was trapped. There was no way out. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, something changed. The knocking stopped. Silence. The air seemed to grow colder, and I could feel a weight pressing down on me, a sense of dread that wouldn't go away. I didn't know if the person was still outside, waiting, or if they had moved on. I didn't care. I just wanted to survive the night. I didn't sleep. The night dragged on, the storm outside eventually subsiding. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, my mind fractured from the fear and isolation. I opened the door carefully, peering out into the early morning light. The forest was quiet, still, and the body was gone. I found the body later that morning, hidden in the woods just a few hundred yards from the cabin. It was too late for the person who had been dragged here, but what struck me the most was that no one would ever know what had happened that night. I left the cabin after that. I couldn't stay another minute. I didn't report what I saw because I didn't know who I could trust. The memory of that face, of the twisted grin and the lifeless body, haunted me for months. The couple never came back to the cabin, stood empty, forgotten, lost to time, and I would never forget what I saw. It was mid-November when I found myself alone in that remote cabin in the middle of the woods. I had never been one for the great outdoors, but life had forced me into it. After losing my job in the city and feeling the weight of a crumbling relationship, I needed a break, some time to think and get my head back on straight. So when I found this little cabin for rent, nestled far out in the wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, I saw it as my escape. The cabin's owner, an old man named Frank, gave me a quick rundown when I arrived. No phone signal, no Wi-Fi, and no neighbors for miles. The closest town was an hour's drive away, and he warned me that wildlife was abundant. Bears, coyotes, even the occasional bobcat. But it wasn't the wildlife that made my stomach tighten as I took in my surroundings. It was the sheer isolation. The cabin was old, far older than I expected, built from rough-hewn logs with a steep, moss-covered roof. The wood had that musty, ancient smell that made me feel like I'd walked into another time. The first night wasn't bad at all. I spent most of it unpacking, making myself comfortable in the cabin's single room, and lighting the fireplace. It wasn't luxurious, just a few mismatched pieces of furniture, an old wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a basic bed. But there was something oddly comforting about the simplicity. The darkness outside seemed to swallow the little cabin whole, and the silence was almost deafening. All I could hear were the crackles from the fire and the occasional rustling of leaves from the trees. But as the hours passed, something shifted. It wasn't anything obvious. No sounds of footsteps outside or strange creaks in the wood, but I began to feel watched. It was an odd sensation, like there were eyes on me, even though I was alone. I tried to shake it off as the result of being in an unfamiliar place, but I couldn't deny that uneasy feeling gnawing at me. I decided to ignore it, as I had nothing else to do but wait for sleep to take over. Around 11:30 p.m., I heard it, a faint scratching sound against the cabin's door. It was so soft that I thought maybe I had imagined it. My heart rate picked up as I strained to listen, but it was gone in an instant. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon, perhaps, or a curious squirrel, but I couldn't bring myself to stand up and check. The thought of opening that door, not knowing what might be on the other side, sent a shiver down my spine. So I stayed frozen in my seat, my eyes glued to the door, waiting for any other signs. Minutes passed, but nothing else happened. The silence returned. I exhaled and leaned back, trying to steady my racing heart. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself. Or maybe I was just paranoid from being so far from civilization. I wasn't sure when I finally fell asleep, but when I woke up, it was still dark outside. I glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m. I could hear the steady rhythm of the rain against the cabin's roof now. It was coming down hard, pouring in sheets, and the wind howled through the trees. Despite the storm outside, the cabin was warm and I felt safe, at least for the moment. But then I heard it again, a thud, a loud bang coming from outside. My blood ran cold, and I immediately sat up, heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what had made the noise, but it wasn't the wind. It sounded like something or someone had hit the side of the cabin. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy, old-fashioned cast-iron skillet from the kitchen, and crept toward the door, my nerves on edge. My mind raced through every possibility. An animal? Person? Some prankster? I had no idea, but I couldn't just ignore it. I slowly and quietly unlocked the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. As soon as I opened the door a crack, I was hit with a blast of cold, damp air and the smell of wet earth. I stepped outside, squinting into the darkness, trying to make out anything through the sheets of rain. But there was nothing. The forest stood still, the only sound the rustling of trees in the wind. No footsteps, no voices, just the eerie silence of the woods. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, gripping the skillet, staring into the dark. It felt like something was lurking just beyond my sight, watching me. But after a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. Probably just the wind, or maybe a branch falling against the cabin. Slowly, I backed inside, locking the door behind me. I tried to shake off the tension that had built up, but I couldn't ignore the strange feeling. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting. I didn't sleep much that night, though I eventually drifted into a fitful slumber, constantly waking up with the feeling of eyes on me. The next morning, I decided to stay inside and avoid the weather. I spent the day reading and cooking, trying to make the most of the quiet solitude. But by the time evening came, the storm hadn't let up. The rain had only grown heavier, and the wind howled even louder than before. I knew I had to do something to shake off the strange feeling from last night, so I went out to gather some more firewood. I made my way to the small shed out back, which Frank had mentioned was stocked with enough wood to last for the week. But as I reached for the woodpile, something caught my eye. A small, torn scrap of paper lay near the base of the shed, half buried in mud. It looked like it had been there for a while. My curiosity got the better of me, and I bent down to pick it up. The writing on it was barely legible, smeared with rain and dirt, but I could make out a few words. "Don't trust the woods she watches." I felt a cold rush of unease sweep over me as I stared at the note. It wasn't signed. It didn't give any context, but the message was clear, and it set my nerves on edge. Who would leave something like that in the woods? And why? I folded it up and stuffed it into my pocket, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the note was a warning. I finished gathering the wood quickly and returned to the cabin, locking the door behind me as soon as I was inside. The fire crackled and popped, but it did little to ease the cold feeling that had settled in my chest. I kept the lights low that night, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of dread. I don't know how much time had passed when I heard it again. This time, it was more distinct. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside the cabin. I froze, my heart in my throat. The noise came closer, stopping just outside the door. I strained my ears, barely daring to breathe, but there was no sound after that.
No knocking, no scratching.
Just silence. I stayed frozen in place, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. It was as though the forest had swallowed whatever it was, leaving no trace. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear sniffing around, and I tried to calm myself down. But as the hours passed, the sense of unease only deepened. Something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the night awake, the fire slowly dying in the hearth, the wind and rain outside growing louder. My mind raced with thoughts of the note, the footsteps, and that feeling of being watched. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the storm, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. Someone was waiting. By the time noon came around, the storm had finally passed. The sky had cleared, but I couldn't bring myself to go outside again. I packed my things, double-checking the cabin to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. As I walked toward the door, I caught one last glimpse of the woods. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching me. It was a woman. She stood perfectly still, her face hidden in the shadows of the trees, but I could feel her eyes on me. My heart raced, and I quickly slammed the door shut, locking it. My breath came in sharp, panicked bursts, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. But when I gathered the courage to look again, she was gone. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag, ran to my car, and sped out of the driveway. The further I got from that cabin, the lighter I felt. I didn't know who or what had been watching me, but I wasn't about to find out. The woods had held its secrets, and I was no longer willing to uncover them. I left behind the note, the fear, and the unknown, relieved to leave the cabin far in my rearview mirror. It was the kind of place that seemed to exist outside of time, tucked deep into the dense forests of northern Michigan. My uncle's hunting cabin, hidden away from the usual hustle of suburban life, was supposed to be my escape. I needed the break, a few days to clear my head. It had been months since I lost my job in Chicago, months since my relationship crumbled, and I figured this would be the perfect place to reset. It was small, with weathered wooden planks lining the walls and a slanted roof that sagged under the weight of years of neglect. But it was quiet, too quiet. I drove up there in early November, just as the days started to shorten, the sun dipping below the horizon by late afternoon. My uncle had offered me the place for a week, saying it was underused these days. He'd gone up there to hunt a few times last year, but hadn't been back in months. The cabin had no electricity, just an old kerosene lantern hanging in the corner. The wood stove in the center of the small living area was what kept it warm during those cold nights, and a single outhouse stood off to the side. I wasn't entirely prepared for how isolated I'd be. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the roads leading up were gravel and barely maintained. There were no cell towers in the area, and my phone had no signal the moment I pulled into the long, narrow driveway. A perfect place to escape, I thought, but the more I settled in, the more the place seemed off. It wasn't anything I could pin down immediately, just a constant sense that I was being watched. The first night was the worst. After a long day of settling in, I started a fire in the wood stove, made myself a meal from cans I'd brought with me, and then sat in the dim light of the lantern, staring out the cabin's small window at the woods surrounding me. The wind was picking up outside, rattling the trees. As the night settled in, the isolation began to feel more oppressive. I tried to shake the feeling of unease, but it clung to me like a thick fog. I told myself it was just the quiet. A week without the constant noise of the city would make anyone feel uneasy. But as the hours dragged on, I found myself hearing things, scratching noises outside the cabin, a low thud against the walls. Every time I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, it would happen again. Tap, a scrape. Then there was a knock on the door. It wasn't a loud knock, just a light tap, as though someone was tapping on the wood with their fingers. I froze, sitting there in the dark, my breath caught in my chest. The thing was, I was absolutely certain no one could have come up the road without me hearing it. It was just too remote, too far off the beaten path. No one was supposed to be out here. I didn't move at first. I listened for any sound, footsteps, the rustling of leaves, but there was nothing. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked. I convinced myself it was the wind. It had to be. I wasn't used to being alone in such an isolated place. But the longer I sat there, the more I started to wonder. Eventually, I stood up, grabbed the lantern, and crept toward the door. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I turned the knob slowly, peeking through the crack. The porch outside was empty, no one there. My heart raced in my chest as I stepped back, trying to rationalize what had just happened. My mind had to be playing tricks on me. I locked the door behind me and tried to go back to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The wind picked up again, louder now, howling through the trees as if the whole forest was groaning under some immense weight. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. At some point, I drifted off, only to be woken in the middle of the night by a noise, a loud bang that came from the roof. My heart leaped into my throat. I scrambled out of bed, my body tingling with a cold sweat. Whatever was on that roof wasn't just an animal. No animal would make that kind of sound. The thing was heavy, too heavy. I grabbed the lantern and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The trees swayed in the wind, but the porch was still empty. I don't know how long I stood there, watching and waiting, but the sounds on the roof continued. It wasn't like a typical animal trying to crawl across a roof. This thing seemed to be pacing back and forth, dragging its feet, almost like it was testing the roof, feeling its weight. The noise stopped just as suddenly as it started, and the silence returned. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe an animal had scrambled up there, though I couldn't figure out why it would move the way it did. The next morning, the weather had turned. The sky was overcast, and the wind had died down, leaving behind a chill that cut straight through my jacket. I stood outside, surveying the cabin and the woods that surrounded it, looking for any sign of something, anything, that would explain the noises from the night before. There was nothing. No broken branches. No sign of an animal or person near the cabin. Everything was still. I spent the day out in the woods, walking the trails nearby, trying to clear my head. The peacefulness of the forest was enough to make me forget about the odd events from the night before. For a while, I convinced myself I was just getting used to the isolation. The cabin's creaks and groans weren't anything strange, just a part of the place settling in the cold air. But then, on the third night, something happened that would make me question everything I thought I knew. I had just finished my dinner and was sitting in front of the fire when I heard it again. A faint tapping, like someone was knocking on the cabin door. I froze, the food half-eaten in front of me. My stomach dropped. The wind was quiet tonight, and yet this sound was unmistakable. It came again, a light knock followed by a pause, then another. This time it was closer, too close. I wasn't going to open the door. No way. Whoever or whatever was out there could stay outside. I moved quietly toward the window, lifting the lantern and peering through the blinds. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, standing just beyond the porch, was a man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket that looked too heavy for the mild weather. His face was obscured by the shadows of the porch overhang, but I could see his hands. They were pale and thin, pressed against the cabin wall as though he was trying to make himself invisible, trying to get closer without me noticing. I backed away from the window, heart pounding. I didn't know who he was or why he was here, but I wasn't about to find out. I grabbed the rifle my uncle had left for me, checked it quickly, and then sat by the door, waiting. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever. The tapping came again. This time it was frantic, almost desperate. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I finally heard the sounds outside fade away. I sat in the dark, my eyes fixed on the door, my pulse still racing. The man had gone, but something told me that this wasn't over. The rest of the night passed in silence, but when the morning light finally crept through the cracks in the wooden walls, I was more certain than ever. I wasn't alone. Not just in the physical sense, but in a way that made me feel hunted. Something out there was watching me, waiting. I spent the next few hours getting ready to leave. I packed my things quickly, not bothering to make sure everything was in its place. All I wanted was to get back to civilization. But just as I was about to turn the key in the door and head out, something stopped me. There, on the porch, just beneath the old rocking chair, was a small item. An object I hadn't seen before. A broken pocket watch, its glass cracked, lying in the dirt. I stared at it for a long moment, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. Someone had been here. Someone had left me a message. I don't know who it was or why they'd come. I never saw the man again, and though I didn't go back to the cabin for years, something about the place stayed with me. A constant reminder of that night when I wasn't just alone in the woods.